Out to 3 minutes past 8 on LBC. Welcome to Monday's edition of Cross Question. We have with us John McDonnell, former Shadow Chancellor, and Labour MP for, remind me of your constituency. Hayes and Harlington. I don't know how I could forget that. Andrea Leadsom is joining us via Zoom, live from the House of Commons. Andrea, welcome to you, former Conservative Cabinet Minister, of course, and Conservative MP for South Northamptonshire. Layla Moran is with us, Liberal Democrat Foreign Affairs spokesperson, and also MP for Oxford West and Abingdon. And the only non-MP on our panel, Toynbee, who, as I'm going to say, is MP for The Guardian. Is that all right? You can call in with your questions on 0345 6060 973, and you can watch us on Global Player, on the LBC website at lbc.co.uk, or the LBC YouTube, Facebook and Twitter feeds.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, let's get our first question. It's from David in Enfield. David, hi. What would you like to ask?
Good evening, panel. Since September 2016, the cost of my residential electricity has gone from 12.5 pence a kilowatt hour to 22 pence a kilowatt hour effective next month. That's an increase of 9.5 pence, or 76% over 5 years. So my question for the panel is twofold. As politicians, why have you allowed this to happen? And secondly, what is the point of the energy regulator Ofgem?
Well, the government introduced an energy price cap, didn't it, Andrea? That doesn't seem to have worked for David.
I mean, I absolutely sympathise. I mean, energy prices are subject to free international price movements, and what the government here did in the last few years is to put an energy price cap on to limit the price rise. And at the same time, you know, what I would love to see us doing is more around electricity market reform to get to more sort of local pricing. So at the moment we've got fantastic generation of renewables, and yet when the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining, obviously we are still very much vulnerable to spikes in the cost of fossil fuels, which is what we're seeing at the moment. So actually, if we move to an environment where local pricing is more commonplace, then people will be able to benefit from, say, putting the washing on in Scotland when the wind's blowing, or charging their car in Cornwall when the sun's shining. So that, I think, in the
I think the connection's given out there. John McDonnell, let's come to you. What do you attribute this to? What could the government have done to prevent David's energy costs going up so much? Or Margaret Thatcher, you'd say you can't buck the market, and I suspect the energy market is quite a difficult one to buck.
We could have helped Ms Leadsom with having free and broadband high fibre, couldn't we? My view is, you know what I'm going to say. This goes back to the privatisation of energy way back in the 80s, the creation of a artificial market. That's what it was, and it hasn't worked. Regulation hasn't worked all the way through. The latest figures on electricity is 30% increase above the rate of inflation since then, and in terms of gas it's 50%. People have just been ripped off. It's as simple as that, and there's been no planning for the long-term future.
But we have a regulator, we have a price cap.
The regulation has not worked. The market hasn't worked. Regulation hasn't worked. That's why I think that privatisation of energy was a mistake. And I would have it back in public ownership so we could plan for the long term. And that we would have both consumers and those who work within the industry itself and local communities managing our energy supply. That's my view. Can I just mention one other thing as well? I've got to say it. You know, in a few weeks' time, the government's going to cut universal credit by £20. It means, in my constituency, means a large number.
We may well have a question.
Okay, but I want to link it to energy because it means in my constituency, a number of families will go cold this winter because they won't be able to afford the energy prices that are going up so rapidly. And it isn't just going cold; it's just being able to cook as well. And you know, we're the 5th largest economy in the world. We should be able to ensure that people don't live in that sort of poverty now.
Layla Moran, what are your constituents telling you? Are they having got similar stories to David in Enfield?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone feels it, don't they, in their own bills? And I've had a few emails today of people who are really concerned. They're with some of these smaller energy companies that have already gone bust. They're worried that the smaller ones that they'd switched to in the hope of being able to lock in at a lower tariff are going to go bust. And so they're looking to the government now to give them the reassurances that they need. I was a bit concerned that Kwasi Kwarteng has not said that he will, if needed, bail out in a Northern Rock style way the smaller providers, because otherwise you are going to have millions of customers transferring potentially on very, very high tariffs. Well,
they automatically go to British Gas, don't they?
I didn't realise that's what happened immediately, because I understood some of them are seeking capital.
There are a couple of companies that have gone bust, and that is what's happened.
That's right. Well, the deals that they did with the smaller companies are not necessarily respected. So people, I heard one on the radio this morning, something like an increase of £900 from the rate for the year. That wipes out, that's doubles the universal credit card.
No, it is. People
and
are
the point around Northern Rock, I was in the House at the time. I was the first MP to raise Northern Rock. What we nationalised to stabilise, and I think we're on the edge of that.
Yeah,
now,
I agree, and I actually think, and whilst actually the Lib Dem view is the markets can work, when they're well regulated, and actually one of the things that we successfully did in coalition, and it was Ed Davey who did it, was bring in more companies into the market in order to create that competition. But we are now at the stage where people want that reassurance, and there are times, particularly in a sort of temporary way, when you've got this, and it is a bit of a perfect storm of a few things that have happened, but there are some things I have to say that the government has dropped the ball on, because in 2016, for example, they stopped the building of zero carbon homes by default. So every new home was meant to be zero carbon.
Well, they tore up the regs, didn't
they? What was happening there? And I went to visit a building site in my constituency, and they were saying ground source heat pumps and air source heat pumps, the cost of them is so high right now. But at the time, they were beginning to go down, because it's a market signal to say, actually, we want to stop our reliance on fossil fuels. We want these other much better ways of heating our homes. And as a result of the scrapping of those regulations, the market hasn't responded. It's now still too expensive, and developers aren't doing it. They've dropped the ball, I'm afraid.
Before I come to you, Polly, let's just go back to Andrea on this idea of a Northern Rock-style bailout for energy companies. Now, that would be a massive thing for the Treasury to undertake, but they've done it before with the banks. They've done it over COVID. Would you see a case for this happening potentially?
Certainly not at the moment. I mean, the whole point was to ensure that there was a proper market in electricity and energy. And so introducing many, many more competitors, from the big 6 to about 28 suppliers at the peak, inevitably will get market failures, which is why Ofgem, exactly as you say, Ian, moves people in the event of a failure to a big supplier such as British Gas. There are market failures in markets. You can't always have the taxpayer bailing them out. It's very easy for John and Layla to say, oh, well, let the government buy it out. That is taxpayers' money. That is the same people who can't afford their energy bills who are going to have to pay for that bailout. So that is not the solution. The solution is actually, as Kwasi Kwarteng is doing, is to make sure that those companies are robust and that there is very clear information around who's in difficulty, so that steps can be taken to move people to another provider if necessary.
My concern is not about, Andrea, so you're clear, my concern isn't about market failure solely. My concern is about people being ripped off continuously throughout this last 30-year period. The price rises above the rate of inflation have been scandalous, and it's resulted actually in many people suffering badly, unable to...
Andrea's just going to vote. So we have an empty chair, Andrea. I just want to make that very clear.
We're not cancelling.
No, we're not. I'm not part of the cancel culture, as you might imagine, John. Polly, what do you make of this? Because this is something that it's not just unique to this country. I mean, energy prices are going up all over the world, but I mean, in Western Europe as well. And yet our per kilowatt cost seems to be a lot higher than Europe at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's been very badly managed. It's a market that doesn't work. Market failure, the whole thing has been a market failure, as John said, right from the start, just as the water industry has been. It isn't something people can take profits out of, and yet they have massively. And of course they haven't, as with the water companies, not building proper pipes, sewers, stopping the leaks and all of that. the electricity company have not built storage, have not built enough capacity. It's a madness to have it privatised at all. These small companies, I think it should all fall back into a national company, and you should start the process of bringing it back in. A lot of these small companies, incidentally, don't have to pay the green levy. They've been let off it, and I don't understand why, because you shouldn't be able to sell electricity unless you also have to pay a green levy to make sure that we are building green capacity.
But one of the arguments at the time, as I remember it, for privatisation was that it was a bit the same with British Rail, in that the public sector weren't investing the money to keep up with what was needed, and the private sector would come in with massive investment. Now, I can't sit here and say that that's actually happened, but certainly on the railways, virtually all of the trains now have been replaced, and they are new. I don't know what's happened in the energy sector.
But the reality is, no, I understand it. But the reality is, look, take rail for example. Those trains have been replaced, but we're putting $9 billion into that. So taxpayers' money is still going in, yet we're still getting high fares, and actually service is pretty poor in some areas. With regard to energy, it's exactly the same. Polly's mentioned water. Water is just an absolute scandal what's happened there in terms of profiteering, failure to deliver, and also the environmental pollution has been appalling. So I actually
think... The water companies say they have invested massive amounts.
Nothing on the scale required, and also nothing that if it had been planned, I think, as one not-for-profit agency, not-for-profit company within the public sector, the investment and the planning would have taken place. In addition to that, on water, I've done a lot of research on water over the last 10, 15 years. Some of these schemes have been used as tax scams as well. You know, it's just been appalling. If you take one privatisation as possibly one of the worst examples, it has been water.
Okay. None of these privatisations make any sense where we, the taxpayer, are putting money in to subsidise private companies to run our services. I mean, either they can run it or they can't, but every time that's what ends up happening. So every time they pay out a dividend, it's actually our money. It just doesn't make any sense.
Well, we've got another great question coming up. But Andrea's back. She's voted very, very quickly. You must have run down those voting lobby. What were you voting on?
I was pushing everyone out of the way. I was voting on the pensions. The pensions triple lock.
All right. Well, we might come on to that in just a moment. It's 8:15.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
18 minutes past 8 is the time. It's Monday's Cross Question with John McDonnell, Polly Toynbee, Layla Moran and Andrea Leadsom joining us live from the House of Commons as well. Now, a big question coming up from Mike in Beverley. Mike, hi, go ahead.
Hi, Ian. Good evening, you and the panel. My question is the government, or when is the government going to U-turn on the universal credit reduction?
Polly Toynbee, I'll come to you first on this, partly because you've written lots of books on this general area. You've done a lot of research into welfare reform, how different reforms affect different parts of the community. Given your background in this, do you think that there is a possibility of the government doing a U-turn?
Well, I think I got it wrong. I wrote a column a few weeks ago saying I was sure they would, because I could not believe they could have any such policy as something called levelling up and expect not to be laughed at if they go ahead with this particularly vicious cut. But I think I'm wrong. I mean, they're getting right to the very edge of the precipice, and it doesn't look as if there's going to be a U-turn. If they were going to, I think they would already have had quite a lot of representation from their own backbenchers. They've had 6 rebels over this. They know there's a lot of disquiet, particularly from their newer MPs in those northern seats they were so proud of winning. So I'm afraid, no, I don't think there will be a U-turn, but I think they may come to regret it. Mm-hmm. I think it may be that even though lots of people think everybody on benefits is a scrounger, despite the fact so many people on universal credit are in work, just topping up very low wages, sometimes public attitudes, we're in a time which is very volatile at the moment. Sometimes public attitudes turn very fast. And I think the picture of, a lot of families in food banks on news night after night, I think the government may regret this.
Layla Moran, you mentioned earlier on the phrase "the perfect storm." Just expand on that a little bit, because you've been. I know the Liberal Democrats have put down an amendment today on the pensions triple lock. Well, that's going. The universal credit is going, and then you've got the potential of massive energy price hikes. Now, if you're a politician and you have deliberately decided not to retain the universal credit hike, even though they said it was temporary. I mean, let's be fair, that was always supposed to be temporary. What's the political fallout from that?
Well, I think, first of all, the triple lock going to the double lock is another manifesto promise broken. And it comes at a time, as you say, when energy prices are going up, and you've now got people who are literally going to have to decide if they're going to heat their home or if they're going to eat. And I think what people need to remember, there was some House of Commons library research suggested the average healthcare assistant, the combined effect of the 3% pay rise will be more than cancelled out by the £20 a week benefit cuts and the 1.25 percentage point tax rise that they're seeing with the national insurance hike to pay for social care. The combination of this on ordinary people, not just ordinary people, frankly, our heroes, these are the people that we went out on a Thursday and clapped for, is, I think, a big misstep. And I completely agree with Polly. I think they are going to end up regretting this, because the idea that somehow Boris is this sort of, in touch with real people, compassionate, understands the working class. Actually, I think this is going to affect so many people, and they're going to know so many people who are affected by it, that I think that it's interesting the number of backbench Tory MPs who were in the lobby with us and who are clearly very, very unhappy about this. I think they could well come to regret this. There is a winter of discontent brewing for a certain section of our population, and it's Boris Johnson who's to blame.
You're far too young to remember the winter.
I've been told all about it, and I was told it was not pleasant.
It wasn't pleasant. Andrea Leadsom, you weren't in the lobby tonight voting against the government. Are you at all concerned about this cut of £20? I mean, we've talked about this on the programme before, and you were fairly, if I remember rightly, fairly unrepentant about it. But how can you have a department for levelling up, which is what the DCLG has now become, and then cut a benefit to those very people who you presumably want to help level up?
Well, I am absolutely with Polly when she says that so many people who at the moment benefit from universal credit are in fact in work. And what the government is focused on, absolutely ruthlessly focused on, is improving skills and improving access to jobs. And so with the Kickstart scheme, with the retraining offers to different people to upskill themselves, and in recognising that many of the people on universal credit are actually needing to be earning more, and that's why they're still receiving universal credit, surely a better way is to look at what's happening now, which is that people's wages are rising. And the government has put in place several increases to, for example, benefits around training schemes and around support for people to get to work and so on, to enable them to actually earn more. And therein lies the difference between what a Conservative government will do and what Labour want to do, which is they want to do handouts, and that was absolutely the same in the run-up to the winter of discontent, which I was alive for. And what we want to do is to give people a hand up to help them back into work.
Okay, what about those who are not in work? What about those who are not in work? You talked about people who are in work, but this is going to really affect people on a very low budget. £20 a week, £1,000 a year. That is a substantial amount of money to many of your constituents.
It absolutely is. And that, of course, is a very different issue. So again, what the government wants to do is to help people into work. But at the same time, the universal credit uplift was similar to furlough, similar to the business rate cuts for businesses. It was designed to help people get through the pandemic, to get through that period of time. It was always set out that it was temporary, and it was always the intention that after the COVID pandemic, we would have to get our fiscal position back in order. And herein lies the real dilemma, is that universal credit, if that temporary uplift isn't reversed, it will cost £5 billion a year. Who is going to pay for that? And there is a real fundamental problem when you're trying to look at a recovery. Of course, Labour and the Liberal Democrats will always say, oh, we'll just borrow more money. But the reality of that is, if we do see inflation creeping in, which we're already seeing because of the fantastic news that people's wages are rising, then what you end up with is the government is paying, at the moment, around £40 billion a year in interest on the existing debt. And that could rocket, that could double very easily. That would cause real problems in our economy.
Up to a point, but you say inflation is rising, absolutely right. That wasn't necessarily foreseen 18 months ago. We didn't know that energy prices would be going up this way. Surely when events change, your mind has to change as well.
Completely agree. And of course it does. And that is precisely why during the COVID pandemic, so many measures were put in place to protect jobs, to protect livelihoods, to uplift universal credit by £20 a week. So many different measures to try and keep the economy going. And that has paid back in spades. You know, our economy has really recovered extraordinarily well. If you look back to what happened after the financial crisis, where we had huge unemployment and 10 years of a very difficult time trying to sort out the position that our public balance sheet was in. And what Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson are trying to do is to make sure that we're not going to put ourselves back in that position by continuing with unaffordable costs, such as keeping that universal credit at the cost of £5 billion a year. Now, who will pay for it? And actually, just this evening, we've been voting on a 1 year limitation to the pensions uprating, again, to try and make sure that we keep our fiscal position in the right position so that people don't end up with long years of austerity as a result.
OK, now people will accuse me of bias because I've let you have a lot longer than the other three, but it's 3 on 1 here, so that's the reason. But Polly, you wanted to come in, and then John.
Andrea, I just have to ask you a question. You wrote an excellent report about children and the desperate state that a lot of children are in. Now, you know very well when you went into that lobby to vote for this that hundreds of thousands of children are going to be thrown into poverty. A lot of children already poor will be thrown even further below the poverty line. You know this because the Institute for Fiscal Studies says so. And yet you seemed to be really caring about the fate of desperate children. To simply say, well, their parents should get jobs, you know that's not the answer when so many of them, for all kinds of reasons, are the people who are in real trouble who can't get jobs because they have all kinds of very serious problems, and their children are going to suffer. How do you feel about that?
I'm going to cut in because we haven't heard from John yet, and if you get Andrea started on early years, she will be here all night, which is not a bad thing, but we'll come to her on that question in a second. But first, John.
Andrea's on.
And Polly is deliberately... Yeah.
No. Andrea, just let John have a word first.
Let me just throw. I'll be brief. Let me just throw in two other factors, because Andrea's raised this issue about wages. The government has introduced a wage freeze across the public sector, so wages are frozen. And where there's been an exception in the NHS, they've been given 3%. Inflation's at 4%. It's a pay cut. So wages are not going to...
Inflation isn't at 4%. Inflation is 3.2%.
Rising to 4% prediction. By the time these universal credit cuts were within that first quarter, we're looking for 4%. That's the problem that we've got. But even if it's above 3% at the moment, that's a wage cut for even those NHS workers that saw us through COVID. The government say would be exempted from the pay freeze. So wages aren't going to do it, I'm afraid. And we need even people going into work now. It means the cut for universal credit will hit them in a matter of weeks. We're talking about what is it? 70% of children in poverty are in households where someone's in work. That's because of low wages over a long period of time. What we desperately need is just an understanding of just how hard and how difficult it is for many of these families to actually get by at the moment. This cut will push people over the edge into poverty. But don't forget what the UN rapporteur said. Didn't use the word poverty anymore. He said destitution. That's the sort of state we're in at the moment.
Andrea, just respond to Polly and John's points.
Yeah, how do I respond? Polly, you completely distorting what I'm talking about. In the early years, it's not about money. It's not about just money. It's about helping families who are literally struggling desperately.
You haven't
with
a
issues
clue. In my constituency, it's about just being able to pay for food.
And paying for childcare.
But Polly, you raised the issue of my early years healthy development review. The issue for so many infants is one of parental strife, parental breakdown, substance misuse, poor mental health issues, and parents who are too young and too insecurely parented themselves to be able to...
You add more pressure on them by cutting universal credit, which will push people into even more stress.
What my review is about is giving families universally support in those early years to help them to provide good parenting, so to give every baby a best start for life. Now, of course, poverty and debt and so on massively comes into it, but it's facile to say that if you're poor, you're going to be a bad parent. That is an absolute insult to the millions of parents.
Nobody said that.
Well, that's
no one said
saying that. No, we're implying that good parents are having a cut in their income and they cannot therefore afford to feed or clothe or make warm their children.
John, we're talking about babies between 0, i.e. in the womb, and the age of 2. So clothes and feeding and heating are completely...
Well, diet is quite important for those women, isn't it? Diet is quite important for those women. And what you're doing now is cutting the benefit that will undermine their diet.
I hope no one's just suggested that the babies can go cold and that's okay.
You are so simplifying. Yeah.
Right.
Offensive.
Okay.
I'm offended. Millions of parents will be offended by the trivial quality of your argument. We could have a proper discussion about this, but you're just ranting about a £20 cut. If we were going to keep that universal credit, £20 a week, it would be far, far better targeted if it was targeted to those families who really are struggling to form a secure bond with their babies.
You're cutting it overall.
And that would be a much better targeting, but you're not arguing for that.
Okay, then why don't you push it into
across the
credits?
board. Yeah,
Why don't you push
rubbish.
it into credits for families with children then, in that case? If you want to target it,
absolutely
but
would,
don't
Polly.
take the money
That's the
away.
Discussion. Yes.
You're not doing that.
Exactly right.
You're not doing
Let's
that.
do
You're
that.
cutting it.
But you didn't vote for that.
You're not doing that.
Okay. I think we could go on this
Please.
subject all evening. Nick saying, Iain giving Andrea Leadsom all the space she wants, of course. As I explained earlier, it's 3-on-1. That's why Andrea has had more time in this discussion. We'll move on to another subject in just a moment. It's 8:32. Let's get the news headlines from Tim Humphrey.
Following an 18-month blanket ban, fully vaccinated foreign nationals will be able to travel to the US from November. The Prime Minister says he's delighted by the decision to reinstate transatlantic travel. The Business Secretary has insisted there's no question of the lights going out amid soaring wholesale gas prices. Kwasi Kwarteng has told MPs the energy price cap will remain and has ruled out bailouts for struggling companies. England's cricket tour to Pakistan is off. The ECB says the joint men's and women's series is being cancelled because of concerns about travelling to the country. LBC weather, rain easing to leave a dry night across the UK, a low of 11.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 8:36. Let me reintroduce our rather spicy panel tonight, I think I can say, and I don't say that in a creepy way. Layla Moran is with us. She is Liberal Democrat Foreign Affairs spokesperson. Polly Toynbee, Guardian commentator. John McDonnell, former Shadow Chancellor, Labour MP for Hazen Harlington.
Spicy before.
Oh, I don't know. You have your moments.
Not me neither.
Andrea Leadsom, though, is the personification of spiciness, particularly tonight. She is former Conservative Cabinet Minister, of course, and MP for South Northamptonshire. Right, next question from Rupert in Lancaster. Hello, Rupert.
Hello, Iain. Hello, panel. So,
Hi.
Make a statement by 9 p.m. or else. Are Insulate Britain blackmailing the government? and how should the government respond?
Well, just to explain that, Insulate Britain, the people behind the M25 protest, they have said that if the government doesn't make a statement within the next 23 minutes that they will insulate all houses in Britain, then they will continue with the protests. Who should we go to first on this? Layla Moran.
So I absolutely agree with the sentiment behind this. And
I can sense a but coming on.
Well, well, first of all, we absolutely need to be insulating all of our homes. It's really important. It's also really progressive. You know, we've been talking about energy price rises, universal credit cuts. Actually, the people who would benefit the most from this would be these very same people. So I think it's really important for protecting the most vulnerable. But I think we're at the point now where it gets to the point, it's got our attention, and I understand the point about, make a statement, get people's attention, but I think now it's turning a bit sour, and I think actually they should probably stop this line and instead focus on other things. I'm also not sure setting deadlines like that is the way to do it. I mean, there are important costed policies. We had a raft of them at our last manifesto, and I think there is a general race to the top in terms of who can be the most green in political parties right now. That's great because we've got COP26 around the corner, we've got a climate crisis, there is no planet B, all of this is still true. I'm just not convinced that, if they don't say it by 9 p.m, we need to get people in 6-hour queues on the M25 is the way to achieve that.
John McDonnell, you supported a few protests in your time.
Right,
What's your view?
I would have gone up there as a minister and met with them and said, we give you the commitment, come and advise us how to do it. That's what I did at Extinction Rebellion. I brought them in to brief our Treasury team, and they helped advise us in development of our Warm Homes Scheme, which would have done all homes over a period of time, created, I think the figure's about 450,000 jobs in doing that. So no, I think you've got to engage with people. So no, I would have sat down and said, I fully agree, that's exactly what we're going to do. Come and help us into a pragmatic way of, advise us on a pragmatic way of how we do that. They're right. They've been given so many promises on this government and nothing's been delivered. You can understand the frustration that's built up.
Absolutely, the frustration, definitely.
This is an existential threat to all of us.
But we know that. Why do we need to be reminded by a dozen people
when
closing
government
off
doesn't respond,
though?
No, but when government doesn't respond with a real programme of how you tackle this, that's what's happened.
Well, I mean, Andrea, you were an energy minister at one point, I seem to remember. Am I right in that?
I was energy minister in 2015 at the Paris Climate Change Agreement, which the UK was one of the first signatories to. And then I was BEI's Secretary of State, which of course includes the energy brief, for in 2019 to 2020. So yes, I mean, I think it's absolutely ridiculous what this Insulate UK are doing. The UK are the good guys. We're leading the G20, we're leading the G7, we're about to host COP26. Our ambitions are massive. The Prime Minister's just announced today over 500 million to help lesser developing economies. He's in New York right now trying to urge countries to be far, far more ambitious in their commitments to lending 150 billion some to developing countries, to middle-income countries so that they can decarbonise. It's absolute rubbish to say that the UK is doing nothing. What, John McDonnell, are you talking about?
I'm talking about the Green Alliance, which has just advised you, this is all the environmental groups, national environmental groups coming together to tell you that actually you're going to fail to meet your target of 2035, you're going to fail to meet your 2050 target net zero, and actually in terms of what you've done around homes, you tore up the very regulations which will enable us to at least have some clear view of how we insulate family homes. That's it. So my view, just listen to people, engage with them. That's all these people are asking for.
John, look at the decarbonisation in the United Kingdom. Our economy's grown by 3/4. We've decarbonised by 44%.
You're missing your own targets.
Reduction in carbon by 2035. John, just look at what we have achieved.
All the independent assessments of that is saying you're missing your targets. Independent assessments.
No, don't repeat
this. This is all work in progress. This is absolutely work in progress. When I was in BEIS, I changed the whole strategy for BEIS so that we would focus on the UK leading the world in tackling global climate change. The plan is to have a roadmap for every part of our economy on how we get down to zero carbon emissions.
What about home insulation? Because the government say they're spending, is it 1.3 billion pounds on home insulation? But as John said, the big announcement that didn't work. I mean, it's a bit like Australia, where they announced this massive program, and then had to scrap the scheme because they got people to work on it, but there were a lot of people that died in sort of unfortunate circumstances in fitting the insulation because they weren't properly trained to. But this 1.3 billion, I mean, what can be done to increase the number of houses that can be insulated without falling into the trap the Australians did?
So that actually is a huge challenge. Retrofitting is, in a sense, low-hanging fruit, but in another sense, one of the most costly ways of doing it. What I think is that the government needs to set out a hard deadline by which no new gas boilers should be installed. Now, at the moment, the debate is, if we do that, air source, ground source heat pumps are terribly expensive. And that is, of course, true. But as we discovered when I announced we were taking coal off the system back in 2015 and everyone said, the lights will go out, actually what happens is businesses immediately work out how to do it and they get ahead of you and they massively shoot the lights out. The same's true with zero emissions from the tailpipe in the cars sector, where already businesses are turning it around. And the same would be true if we announced we were stopping gas boilers.
We haven't heard from Polly on this yet. Polly, a point that Andrea made there, which I think was slightly drowned out, was that compared to other Western European countries, our record, particularly on decarbonisation, I think is second only to Sweden. And yet we're being given the impression that we're completely useless in this area.
Better than some, less good than others. The point is we have our own targets, and everybody keeps talking about our targets, what we signed up to in Paris, all of the rest of it. We're not meeting them, nor has Boris Johnson produced any pathway to show how we're going to get to 2035 and he's pushing them back. The date when we will ban new gas boilers has been pushed back. So of course we need to insulate. Also, the whole idea of a Green New Deal is huge investment in jobs, in skills, in training. A lot of those people who are furloughed are going to need jobs, and they're coming off furlough shortly. There should be a perfect scheme in place everywhere for them to already have been trained to do that retrofitting. It's job work that needs to be done that will save people a lot of money in terms of their heating bills. Now, when it comes to this demonstrations have to be very imaginative and clever. The Extinction Rebellion closing down London by shutting the bridges was phenomenal. It was quite exceptional, and it made a whole lot of people sit up and think.
Did it?
Yes, I think it really did. I think it really astounded people.
I think it was a game changer, actually.
I think it really, really made a difference. I think this thing of shutting off the motorway hasn't really worked in the same way. You've got to keep thinking of new imaginative ways.
I would say it's worked brilliantly. I mean, there are literally 10 or 15 people that do this. It's not like hundreds of them are doing this. It's 10 or 15 people.
But it's made people very angry.
The police just stand there and do absolutely nothing to move them on. I think it's a phenomenally successful.
The idea is to try and persuade people. You want to persuade people. You're not trying to alienate them. And I think this has not worked very well because I think it's been more alienating than it has been persuasive. You want to go to the places that are relevant, the ministries, the departments. You've got to think of imaginative ways of blockading, if you like, those people and places that are responsible for this policy.
Andrea, quickly.
Just wrecking people's lives is utterly destructive. What they should be doing, what we as a country should be doing, is some big deals at COP26. We only emit 1.5% of global emissions. And yes, we're responsible for a lot of the problems we have today. So we need to show global leadership. So why not be campaigning for the UK to have a huge, 200 gigawatts of wind power with China by 2030, or 2 million hectares of tree planting with Brazil by 2030 around the world.
I think they are.
Sort of bilateral
I think
deals.
They are campaigning
That's
for that.
That's the sort of thing that people should be doing, not trying to wreck people's ability to get home from work or to go about their daily life.
Layla, very quickly.
I will very quickly say I agree both with them in their frustration, but I don't agree with the method. But I do agree that COP26 has to work. And I'm really concerned that the UN chief says today that it's at risk of failure because of mistrust between developed and developing countries. And the aid cuts that this government did have done nothing to help to build trust in the run-up to COP26. It's completely undermined trust and is going to have a negative effect on our ability to tackle this enormous crisis.
Sometimes people say that this programme should be renamed Don't Get Very Cross Question. I think tonight it's got a very appropriate title. It's 8:47.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player.
Chris, who said that he effectively watched his mother draining away in front of his eyes because he was trapped a journey that should have taken an hour and a half, took 6 hours. Liam Norton for Insulate Britain. There's every chance that Chris is listening. What would you say to him?
Our hearts go out to Chris and his mother. It's a tragic situation. It sounds like you can't emotionally connect with the truth.
Don't lecture me about emotional connection. You've just heard a caller explain how he watched his mother effectively drain away for 6 hours. Don't lecture me.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
With the British Airways American Express Accelerating Business Card, check out the world.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
8:51. Now, those of you who are watching will notice that we have a rather depleted panel now. We've had to have a bit of a, well, I was going to say reshuffle, but Layla Moran and John McDonnell and indeed Andrea Leadsom have all got to go and vote on something to do with Police and Crime Commissioner elections. Yeah, don't ask me, I have no idea what it's all about. Andrea's office, though, is right next to the voting lobby, so she promises that she will return. In the meantime, Polly and I are going to have a little talk between ourselves and answer some questions from Noel in Gloucester. Hello, Noel.
Oh, yeah. Basically, I really wanted to know from John McDonnell as well. Do they really think Keir Starmer could ever be Prime Minister?
I think that's the reason John's left. He didn't want to answer your question, Noel, probably. Polly, now you've written a lot about Keir Starmer over the last 18 months or so, or in fact longer than that. It's a good question, isn't it?
It's a good question. We always look at all leaders of parties and wonder how they'll shape up to be Prime Minister. My own view is that if he could get there, if he can get elected, he would be the best Prime Minister by far for many, many a long year, I would say. I'd say he'd be the best since Tony Blair. The question is, can you get elected these days when politics seems to have become theatre, pantomime? Boris Johnson has turned it into showbiz, a reality show. And Keir Starmer is a serious, thoughtful, decent man. He's more in the sort of Clement Attlee mode. Clement Attlee couldn't get elected these days, though he was a brilliant Prime Minister. And I think that's true of most of his front bench too. You look at them, they are thoroughly decent, serious lot who are very well briefed in their particular departments. And I think they'd make a terrific government. But if it's all about Strictly and the jungle for politics, it's not this bunch.
Isn't it more basic than that, though, in that on the right you've got one party, the Conservative Party. I mean, UKIP's gone, the Brexit Party's gone, nothing's replaced them. On the left, you've got the Liberal Democrats, Labour and the Greens. And just as in the 1980s, when the left-wing opposition was split between the Alliance, which you were a member of, and the Labour Party, Margaret Thatcher got massive majorities. History is repeating itself, isn't it?
Yes, it's a terrible problem. It's been true across a lot of Europe too. But they have a better electoral system. We have an electoral system where it's almost guaranteed that whichever party wins is in a minority. In the last election, majority didn't want Boris Johnson, but they got Boris Johnson. And unless we have electoral reform, unless we get rid of first past the post, that's going to keep happening. At the last, for instance, the last local elections in May, in 85% of the seats, there was just one Tory standing against 2 or 3 or more left-of-centre candidates. So, of course, they did extremely well. I think you need a progressive alliance, at least temporarily, to bring all these left-wing parties together so that they can at least get into power and change the electoral system. When you do that, we can have new parties. We won't be stuck in this stranglehold between the two old parties. And you have a chance of, people having new ideas in politics, starting something different. You sounded like
Shirley Williams used to
in the
1980s.
I agreed.
Andrea has voted faster than a whippet, I have to say, and she's back with us. And Andrea, Noel in Gloucester has asked, do you ever really think that Keir Starmer could be Prime Minister? Andrea, can you hear us?
Well, I sincerely hope not. I think the Labour Party is still pretty Sorry, can you not hear me?
Yeah, we can, but I think there's a delay on you hearing me, so just carry on.
Okay, yes, I think Keir Starmer won't be Prime Minister because I think that the Labour Party is still very unreformed. I think what Jeremy Corbyn did was to allow some extremely left-wing and completely unacceptable people back into the party. And I think it's made them largely unelectable because of the way that their policy writing works makes it extraordinarily difficult. And I do think that there are some really lovely people in the Labour Party, people I would call friends, but I think their chances are very, very constrained by the framework of their party right now.
OK, Noel in Gloucester, what do you think?
I don't think. I think basically we need to step down because we got no chance. We got no chance under him. No one.
Who would you like to replace him, Noel?
That's a difficult one. I would like someone. See, I don't class the Labour Party as left wing now, because they're centre right, and Boris has moved to the centre. And where are they? What do they do? Their next manifesto is just going to say what he said. There's nothing they can do.
Can I take you up on something, Noel? The idea that Boris has moved to the centre, this clown is pretending to be everything to everyone. What matters, as you well know, is the money on the table. We have had an austerity budget. We're about to get another one in October. Everything is going to be cut again and again. Schools are not back to the funding it was in 2010. The NHS waiting lists are not going to be tackled by too little money. There is no more money for social care. I mean, the idea that you've been fooled by Boris into thinking that he's moved leftwards, that really makes me despair, because if even someone on the left like you thinks that, God help us.
John on text says, no, it's not John. He says it's a disgrace that I made John leave. I would have loved to have heard John's response to this question, I have to say. So he had to go and do his democratic duty and vote, I'm afraid. The next question is Chris in Richmond. Chris, forgive me, but I'm going to read out your question because we haven't got much time left. He wants to ask, given that most politicians haven't spoken up enough about the treatment of Rosie Duffield, are women politicians really safe anymore? Rosie Duffield is Labour MP for Canterbury. She says she can't attend the Labour Party conference because of her remarks on trans issues. She doesn't think that she would be safe. Andrea Leadsom, I don't know if you want to comment on Rosie Duffield's situation, but what about more generally? Are women in politics really safe anymore?
Well, I really, really feel for Rosie. I think she's obviously had a horrendous time. I think we also had some horrendous experiences over particularly female politicians being targeted with anti-Semitic remarks. The racism against women MPs on the left and on the right has been utterly unacceptable. So yes, I think it is pretty dreadful. And there are lots of younger women who don't want to go into politics for that reason now. They feel that they don't want to subject themselves and their families to that kind of abuse. It is pretty vile.
Polly?
I really hope Rosie Duffield does go to the Labour Party conference. I know she's talking to people tonight and make sure that she gets whatever protection it is she feels she needs. I despair about the whole trans issue in that all of my life I've been involved in equality campaigns and in women's campaigns, feminist campaigns, and they keep being riven and split and split and split again by insane divisions between people who broadly agree. The trans issue has been the worst I've come across in terms of dividing people who could sit down and make sensible, practical compromises on this. Nobody wants to discriminate against trans people. This is a kind of craziness.
Final text from Geraldine in Saddleworth. 4 former Prime Ministers have turned down invitations to a centenary dinner at Chequers, leaving Boris Johnson to host only Theresa May at his country retreat. Who would be your dream dinner guest? And while you're thinking of your answers, I'll just tell everyone that tomorrow on Cross Question we have the Labour MP Chris Bryant, the journalist and writer Iain Dunt. He's got a new book out called How to Be a Liberal. Juliet Samuel, who's a Telegraph columnist, and the Conservative MP Ben Bradley. Polly Toynbee, who would your dream dinner guest be, apart from me, obviously?
Marcus Rashford on one side, Judi Dench on the other, please.
Oh no, I'd come to that one. Andrea Leadsom.
Well, does it have to be someone alive?
No, you can choose whoever you like.
Okay, I'm going to go for William Wilberforce.
Oh.
Well, now that would be an interesting conversation.
Right, Polly. Just always presume, don't you? No, William Wilberforce, for those who don't know, he was largely attributed with being one of the first enlightened MPs who really spoke out and made sure that the slave trade was abolished. So, yeah,
and William Hague has written a very good book about him. Good choices. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks to Polly Toynbee, Andrea Leadsom, Layla Moran and John McDonnell. If you missed any of the programme, you can always catch up on the Cross Question podcast, or it'll all be on YouTube on the LBC channel a little bit late. Well, in fact, it's probably there now. You're listening to LBC. In a moment, we are going to ask you what you think the government's response should be to the ultimatum made by Insulate UK. They said that the government had to tell them by 9 o'clock tonight, i.e. 1 minute ago, what their response would be on home insulation. I suspect the government haven't given a response. What do you think they should say to this campaign group? It's 1 minute past 9.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock. The White House says fully vaccinated UK travellers will be able to visit the US from November. The lifting of the ban, which has been in place for 18 months, will allow families to reunite for Thanksgiving.